The bottom quintile share was about 1.5 billion, which averaged $63 per household. The top quintile share was about 90 billion, and that averaged almost $4,000 per household. Now, to this member of the top quintile, that's a lot of money. I can finance a trip to Hawaii for the three of us, my wife, daughter, and me, for that, if we don't eat out of a restaurant. Then if we go further up the income range, we get an even bigger cost per household. First, because there's more income to tax, and second, because their tax rate is even higher. The top 1% paid an average of 31% of all its income in all federal taxes, and paid 28% of all federal taxes. So 1% of the households pay 28% of federal taxes. So the 1.2 million households in the top 1% paid an average of $31,000 per household. That's a lot of trips to Hawaii. In short, high-income people are paying a very high share of the budget cost of the U.S. war in Iraq. Now, of course, given our budget deficits, you can easily challenge my assumption that it's paid for out of taxes. It's really paid for out of the deficit. But the deficit means future taxes. So unless they radically change the way they tax people at the federal level, future high-income people, and I would bet, you're at Berkeley, I would bet 60% of these people in this room in 15 years are going to be in the top quintile, and you'll be paying for it.
What's the income for that?
Good question. I can give you a rough, okay, the top quintile, the cutoff would be, I think around, this is going to be rough, I think around 100 and, I would say, we got a recession on now, so let's lower. I'm going to say 90 to 95,000 a year.
And you're saying that most of them are paying, a lot of money for the war, but there's really not a lot of them in the top 1%.
Right.
So it's mainly the middle class that's paying for the war, I would think.
No, it's the top end of the, okay, if we define, there's a question of how you define middle class. My view is the middle should include more than 60% of the people. So the middle three quintiles, only the top of that middle is paying much, and they aren't paying that much. It's really the top quintile. So like some people say I'm a member of the upper middle class. That's absurd. I'm in the top quintile, right? I'm in the upper class, or whatever it is you call them. So, yeah, so we have a very distorted view, I think, of what middle is.
I agree with that.
Yeah, yeah. Now, it is true that there's one burden of the war that is paid disproportionately by low-income people, or at least was paid a few years ago. And that is that when you had the war going on, the hot war in Iraq, they were actually producing less oil out of Iraq than they were producing during the UN sanctions when exporting oil was illegal. And so with less oil produced in the world market, and with what economists call a highly inelastic demand at the world level for oil, that small reduction of about 500,000 barrels a day of oil caused the price of oil to be approximately 5% higher than it would have been. So we translate that into today's dollars. We're paying about $85 a barrel now. So approximately about $4 or $5 of that is would have been due to the restrictions or to the insurgent flowing up pipelines and reducing the oil supply and so on. So lower income people paid more because if you have double the income, you don't consume double the oil, you consume more, like 50% more oil. Lower income people paid a higher proportion of that. Although I ran the numbers, and it turns out to be approximately, certainly under $100 a year for what they paid for. Okay, now, who gains from the wars? I think there are three main groups, if we're talking about Americans. Three main groups. one of which everyone focuses on, and two of which almost no one focuses on, and I want to talk about all three. The one that everyone focuses on, quite correctly I think, is defense contractors. Boeing, Lockheed, what's the Raytheon. They all gain from the war. Now, and that's true, and I want to say a little more about that. Specifically, I want to say why it's not companies in general. So let me give you just a sample calculation. Let's say the government spends $1 billion on a firm, buying stuff from a firm that's a member of what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. And that firm produces bombs that were dropped in Iraq. Is the gain to that firm $1 billion? No. What is it? $1 billion minus what?
Costs.
Their costs. So a typical profit as a percent of revenue for an American firm is somewhere between 5 and 10%. So let's go to the upper end. Let's go to 10%. So that's as much as you can imagine. So that's $100 million the firm gains. And the government spent $1 billion to give them that $100 million gain. And so the $900 million is, in a sense, a dead weight loss. And that probably understates it because the bombs are probably used. And so they produce more of a loss. They kill people. Yes?
I'm going to take issue with your math.
You may.
The 10% only applies to the one company, but all of their costs include, say, the labor costs they're using. Those people are going to be going off. And I mean, labor is, if you want, pure profit.
No, it's not. Because those laborers, first of all, good point, because I simplified. But let's look at those laborers. Those laborers are working for some wage for the company. Their alternative. Sorry?
They have an opportunity.
Bingo.
I'm aware of it.
Yeah. And so their alternative, the other people who are, who here is an economist? Or economic, okay, so like 20% even. What he's getting at, or what he's getting at is they get a gain. What I'm getting at is the size of their gain is not their wage, but the difference between the wage they get in that job and the wage they could get in the next best job, because they're giving up working somewhere else. And so a typical number for that, for the person on the margin, it's 0, because that person could have gone to some other job. For other people, maybe it's 10%, 15% of the wage, or so.
But that really wasn't the main point.
Oh, okay. Oh, shoot, I wasted all that energy.
More that, say the defense contractor is buying steel.
Right.
The cost of their steel, some amount of that is profit to the steel mills.
Right.
And to, say, unionized steel workers. And the steel mill operators are going to be paying for ore, which has a profit component to it.
And each of those, you'd want to...
Each of those is a small slice,
yes.
But if the total figure for any one company is 10%, then that has to get propagated through the entire supply chain.
Right.
But if you go down to the supply chain, isn't it better to make a bridge than a tank?
Yes.
Like,
yes, and if the bridge is valuable, which presumably it is, it's built where people want it, and not a bridge to nowhere, okay? Then the difference in the loss is the difference between the value of the bridge and the others, the stuff actually spent on it, which I think, again, you'll see my anti-war bias here, but I think that's pure loss, essentially. And so the point is that companies in general don't gain. And this is really the important point of it. Companies in general lose from war because they're paying some substantial part of their profits as taxes, and they're not getting it unless they're a defense contractor. So it's pretty easy to show Raytheon is better off, Boeing is better off, Lockheed, what's it called now? Lockheed Martin's better off. But the average company is worse off, and the average person is worse off. Now, I'm making an implicit assumption, which is that the war isn't worthwhile. Okay? If the war is worthwhile, that changes it. But if the war is a bad idea, the point is people in general aren't gaining. People in general are losing. Now, so that's the first group. But the second group of people who gain, and this isn't talked about much, they're often talked about as if they lose, that's people in the military. I mean, think about the fact that everyone in the military is a volunteer. So they're choosing what they regard as their best option. And if there's a war, they get paid more typically. I talk to my students, and they get these big bonuses just for being in the war theater. Also, because they're in the war theater, the time they're there, they don't pay any taxes. And a few of them who are making $80,000 to $90,000 a year are getting the earned income tax credit because their income looks really low, the part that's subject to the tax. Now, there's one exception. Who here has heard of stop loss? Yeah, and so if you're an enlistee in the military, a lot of them didn't read the fine print. And they join, they think they've got a certain term, the United States is at war, and they want out, and guess what? You can't get out.